This is the Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 22nd chapter. Once more Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" This is the gospel of the Lord, and you may be seated. So I faced a rather tough decision figuring out what to preach on with this gospel. There is a lot there. And then I looked at the first and second lesson, I looked at the psalm, and I realized that our reading from Philippians is hitting me where I am at in life. And so I'd like to preach on Philippians on this fine morning. And Sam, you did a great job of getting those names. Those are really hard names. Euodia and Syntyche. Not exactly names that just roll off the tongue. It would have been a little more common in the Greek world than it is nowadays. I don't know too many Euodia. I can't even say it, and I've been to 4 years of seminary. Euodia and Syntyche. Those are not very common names. So the other day, I was talking to a friend, and my friend posed to me a very interesting question. He said, "If you had $1 million to change the world, what would you do?" If you had $1 million to change the world, what would you do? And I thought about it for a really long time, and I didn't have an answer for him in the moment. It was a phone conversation. And I don't know, for whatever reason, that really got me thinking, what would I do to change the world if I had $1 million? And then I was watching CNN, and I had sort of a light bulb moment as I was watching CNN. You know how they have all the different talking heads that are discussing a certain issue, and they all pop up on the screen, and nobody really listens to each other at all. They're always talking over each other. And nobody really seems to agree at all. And they're really listening to one another in order to respond rather than listen to one another to understand. And you don't just see that happening on CNN. You see that in politics. You see that in communities. People not really listening to one another. And if people disagree with each other, sometimes they just walk away and don't ever talk to each other again. You see that sort of thing happening all over the place. And it can be really hard to even have just civil conversations, or people aren't going at it with one another. So I thought, if I had $1 million to change the world, I would open up a center that would teach how to get along with one another, how to have good and healthy conversation with one another, how to work towards reconciliation with one another, how to listen to one another, not to respond, but to listen to one another to understand. It kind of goes back to that everything I need to know about life I learned in kindergarten. Are you familiar with that? I think that's so true. Maybe I'm inspired too, because Paul in his kindergarten class is learning about how to get along with his classmates. And I think this text that we have from Philippians would be an excellent text to use to base that center on. There are some great rules in this text. So there would actually be 4 principles to my center in how to get along with one another that we'll get to in just a moment based on this Philippians text. I'm dreaming here. It's kind of fun. So in this text, in this Philippians text, Paul is writing from jail. Paul is in prison. And the people in Philippi, this text is written to the people in Philippi. They're the Philippians, right? The Philippians, the church in Philippi, they're having some disagreements. They're not getting along with one another. They're struggling. Thank goodness that never happens in the church or in our communities. We always get along, right? Right? No, it's always been there. People have always disagreed about stuff. So people are having a disagreement of some variety or disagreements, and we don't really know what they're disagreeing about. But there are these 2 people, Euodia and Syntyche, must be really struggling. They must be having some kind of disagreement because Paul calls them out in this text. He says in verse 2, I urge Euodia. I'm just trying to be able to say Euodia at least 20 times in my sermon because it's so fun. I urge Euodia, I urge Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I also ask you to be my loyal companion. So certainly there were other disagreements, but that's the real disagreement right there between those 2. And whenever there's a disagreement or disagreements in communities, whenever people aren't getting along, that tends to leak out into the whole community. It's called systems thinking. If one part of the system isn't working, it affects all parts of the system as well. So Paul does not want this disagreement and other disagreements to affect that whole system, that big community system or big family system in Philippi. He does not want that to happen. And he knows these women very well, and he knows that they have done amazing things in the past to build up this community. So he puts their disagreement into perspective, thereby helping all these other things, all these other disagreements that they may be having. He helps them to put them into perspective. He says that their names are in the book of life, that is God's family tree. In the grand scheme of here to eternity, do these women want to spend their time either hating or loving? What would God have them do? And we could perhaps ask that same question. Do we want to spend our lives loving or hating? Do we want to spend our time constantly thinking of ways to get back at people who have wronged us? Or do we want to work toward reconciliation so that we can breathe easier and sleep better at night, living as God's children ought to do? Paul goes on to give these women and the rest of the community some habits that allow us to live in God's peace, a peace that surpasses all understanding. And this is what Paul says. He says this, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. Do not worry about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So here are my 4 principles for this imaginary center of how to get along and love one another, if I were to create that with that $1 million. So here they are. The first one is rejoice. Be grateful for what you have and what you have been given. I read a quote somewhere that said, an ungrateful person can never learn to pray. So rejoice. That's number 1. There's a quiz at the end as well. Second one, be gentle with the people in your life. How often do we take people for granted and handle them roughly or unkindly? Be gentle, Paul is saying. Be gentle with the people in your life. First one, rejoice. Be gentle with the people in your life. The third one, know that God is near. God doesn't just sit in heaven getting foot massages and eating bonbons or zoning out while watching football or perhaps the Cubs. God is very near to us, intensely a part of this world that he has created. So rejoice, be gentle with the people in your life, know that God is near. And then lastly, this is a really hard one. Do not worry, but pray and bring all of your concerns to God. These are the habits of the heart and mind that will give us the kind of peace that will guard our hearts and minds and give us peace beyond our comprehension. The way that things become habits is that we actually start doing them and practicing them. We think about doing things that are good for us. We can want to start doing something. We can dream about doing something. But until we actually start doing something, it will never become a habit. And we have to do things more than once for them to become habits. So we must practice over and over again how to be joyful and how to be grateful. We must practice over and over again how to be kind and how to be gentle. We must practice over and over again noticing God's presence in our lives. We must practice over and over again how to bring every concern to God in prayer rather than just worrying endlessly. But we are so often afraid to practice these God-given habits of the heart and mind because perhaps we're more comfortable trying to control the future and avoid disagreements or difficult situations. But Paul, the great apostle Paul, wants us to keep things in perspective. Our names are written in the book of life. That should affect us how we live right now. Not only what happens to us when we die, but right now. Being a Christian isn't about having an easy life and a free ticket into heaven. It's about constantly seeking God right now, no matter what life throws at us, and practicing these 4 habits of discipleship. So you've probably heard of Steve Jobs. He was the creator of Apple. And I love Apple products, as evidenced by my iPhone and iPad and my Apple notebook as well. Well, he died several years ago, and I'm pretty sure he wasn't a Christian, but he had a rather interesting way of looking at life. And this was especially after an initial cancer diagnosis that he had. And he spoke at a college graduation ceremony. This was way back, I think around in 2005. I think he had an interesting approach to life that worked to keep things in perspective, kind of like Paul is encouraging us with this text, to keep things in perspective, to remember that our names have been written in the book of life. And this is what he said. When I was 17, I read a quote that went something like this: "If you live each day as if it were your last, someday you'll most certainly be right." It made an impression on me, and since then, for the past 33 years, I have looked in the mirror every morning and asked myself, if today were the last day of my life, would I want to do what I'm about to do today? And whenever the answer has been no, for too many days in a row, I know I need to change something. Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important in life. No one wants to die. Even people who want to go to heaven don't want to die to get there. And yet death is the destination we all share. No one has ever escaped it, and that is as it should be, because death is very likely the single best invention of life. It is life's change agent. It clears out the old and makes way for the new. Right now, the new is you, but someday, not too long from now, you'll gradually become the old and be cleared away. Sorry to be dramatic, but it is quite true. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and your intuition. It's interesting that we as Christians who have our futures secure because of the cross, because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, even us, even we Christians can be afraid of death. But sometimes we can be even afraid of truly living. Truly living is really, really hard work. Steve Jobs did not get to where he was in the computer world by avoiding tough things. And we do not experience God's peace by avoiding the 4 habits of faith or discipleship. Live a life that's worthy of God. Don't let fear of the future and tricky situations like disagreements keep you from living the life that God has in store for you. Your names are written in the book of life. Your futures are secure because of the cross, and we're called to live as such. Practice the habits of the heart and mind that will lead to a peace that surpasses all understanding. Rejoice, be gentle, know that God is near. Don't worry, but bring everything to God in prayer. And let the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Amen.